All right. It is my honor to introduce S. Mandisa Moore O'Neill, she, hers. She is the Executive Director of CHLP, a national research and advocacy organization that fights stigma and discrimination at the intersection of HIV, race, health status, disability, class, sexuality, and gender identity and expression, with a focus on criminal and public health systems. Based in New Orleans, she is a Black feminist attorney, a trained facilitator, and a cultural and political strategist. Before joining CHLP, Mandisa founded the Moore O'Neill Law Group, LLC, a Black feminist law and policy practice. Her practice focused on HIV decriminalization litigation, education and advocacy, family law litigation, education and advocacy, employment and public accommodations discrimination litigation and education, and police accountability litigation and advocacy. She was also the litigation and policy director at Frontline Legal Services. Mandisa is a founding member of the Louisiana Coalition on Criminalization and Health, and in 2012 received her JD from Louisiana State University Law Center. Mandisa has researched, published, and presented on abolitionist lawyering, reproductive justice and the law, HIV decriminalization, punitive social policies, and state violence. At its core, her legal work is best defined as using a Black feminist and abolitionist framework to craft legal strategies that move us closer to liberation.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. Let's try it as far with the door open, just in the interest of accessibility. And if folks feel like they can't hear or just want it to be closed, I think we have the option of doing that as well. Thank you for that bio, Daniel. I'm Mandisa. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And when I was asked as far as to talk about this, I was very excited, to talk about it in terms of it's odd to see my name and have an organization sort of attached to it. I know like a lot of folks in here have been a part of the movement to address modernizing our state statute. I'll talk more about that and the many reasons why it's in dire need of reshaping. As of October 1st, I actually moved into a more national role as the ED for CHLP, which stands for the Center for HIV Law and Policy. So I'm just excited to have been asked to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about criminalization in the context of stigma, which is not always a lens that we have this conversation in, and it's important that it always be in that framework. It's my goal in this conversation to be accessible as well as interactive. I have, slides and conversations. It's definitely opportunities to ask questions. That's an important part of why I want this conversation. Not for me to be talking, for y'all to listen, because how does that grow anything other than ego? So I'm hoping that there'll be a lot of discussions. So as we talk about stigma, it's really important to also talk about HIV criminalization, in that HIV criminalization is simultaneously built on stigma, but it also perpetuates stigma. So if you think about it, it's really stigma. It's hard to say what came first because they influence each other. When you're criminalized, that in and of itself is stigmatizing, but why you're criminalized is because of existing stigma. So you see how it just grows bigger and bigger. And so one way of addressing stigma is to address its largest cousin, which is criminalization. So again, acknowledging that stigma is a larger conversation, in this conversation it is going to be focused on criminalization. That's actually something that we can address. That begs the question, what is HIV criminalization? It's two words that, I imagine we've all heard. HIV, we're in this work, and we've heard criminalization. So together, what is it? In summation, it is the arrest, it's the threatening of arrest, it's the actual prosecution, the threat of prosecution, It's the incarceration, so the whole criminal legal span. It's not just one part, it's the whole thing. You can be criminalized and never spend time in a prison. Just that fear is enough to fall under the umbrella of criminalization. So it's very broad. If we just focus on who's incarcerated, it could seem like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But as we remember, there are thousands of people who are in the fear of criminalization. That's a part of HIV criminalization, because if we didn't have criminalization, people wouldn't have that fear, which then limits people's lives and agency in so many concrete ways. But it's that whole sphere of people living with HIV for something that is not normally criminalized or is a minor offense. In other words, one's HIV status is used as a standalone to single someone out. In the US, so I'll start in general, and then I'll focus on our lovely state, which, as we can imagine, we are often trendsetters for a lot of the reasons that aren't that exciting, but we are trendsetters nonetheless. So in the US, criminalization looks like two ways. One is HIV specific criminal statutes, meaning there's a specific criminal law that says if you have HIV and engage in sexual activity or something else that's defined super broad and vague, you'll be prosecuted. There are over 30 states and U.S. territories that have an HIV-specific criminal statute. Louisiana is one of those states. Surprise, surprise, it's one of the first to have a law like that. That was first passed in 1987. But it's also possible to embody HIV criminalization if your state doesn't have a specific statute. So, like in Texas, for example, there is no HIV specific statute, yet folks are still charged under things like reckless endangerment, attempted murder. So sometimes, if you research, you'll be like, oh, it's better in Texas, or it's better in Illinois, or it's better in New York State because they don't have a specific statute. But if you look at the rest, there are still people living with HIV who are arrested under these general laws. Then you have some states like Louisiana who've arrested people under both, under the HIV specific statute, and there are cases from the 90s of folks being arrested and serving time for reckless endangerment or attempted murder. So in my work, I find it helpful not so much to focus on whether or not a state has a statute or not, but to focus on how whatever statute you have is applied and targets people living with HIV. But what's really interesting is these laws also often focus on non-disclosure or exposure as the basis, as opposed to specific intent. Now, I am a lawyer, I am a defense lawyer. That's not necessary to understand what is challenging when you don't focus on specific intent. When I just have a broad policy that just says, if you know that you have HIV and you do this thing, that's enough to be found guilty under this statute. That's very different than saying, you know you had HIV and you specifically intended to harm. You see the differences? Yeah. One's super broad and one's super specific. What happens historically if you have something super broad? It catches people who perhaps the original intent of the law was not meant to catch. Also, it sends a message that knowing your status and engaging in activity that you've been told is safe to engage in, it sends a message that if you know me, you know this, fuck what the science is telling you, you could still be found guilty and in prison. So, AKA, I've done the right things, quote unquote, but the law is focusing on a general, not specific, and is saying exposure. Then there are sometimes enhancements if you are perceived to be a sex worker, or if you're somebody who's perceived to be, injects drugs. So it's like the statute starts with 10 years. If you're a sex worker, it's now +5, so up to 15. Or if you're somebody who injects drugs, +3 or whatever. So that's also very problematic in terms of, I think we all know, it's often folks who are engaged in sex work, it's often folks who inject drugs who are most vulnerable in our communities. And so a common question as far as to ask, if the goal is public health, how are these laws meeting that goal? How is incarcerating someone when we know what's happening in the prisons, knowing that there isn't access to health care for anyone? How is that meeting our public health goals? Because again, that was the basis for these laws, to protect the public, to protect public health. So just a question to have in your head as you're talking about this, how does what actually happen do the things that we're told it's supposed to do? And last, many states require you, 6 to be exact, require you to register as a sex offender, which it's already very stigmatizing in terms of having a felony on your record. It's even more stigmatizing if you have to have a sex offender, on your license, because it's even more restrictive in terms of places to live. Like, you can't be, close to a school. Imagine you're a parent. It's people across the country, including here in Louisiana, who can't visit their children's school for school reports, for school plays. Think about the impact that has on someone's quality of life if that child sees, well, everyone else's parent can come visit me, how come mine can't? The impacts are very far-reaching. One of the things that CHOP is known for is making infographics that kind of take all this information and make it more pleasing to the eye. This map was last updated in June 2022. Our goal is to update it yearly because there are changes a lot. And actually, in the climate of COVID, many states are actually passing these laws that they say is focused on communicable diseases, which, how it's written, it definitely includes HIV. So it's definitely important for us to at least once a year update and just make sure that it's the most accurate information. So as we see, our lovely state is one that has a specific criminal law, but we also prosecute under general laws. Thus we have the stripe, purple, or I don't know, is that reddish purple and orange? Then we have the yellow, indicating we do require people to register as a sex offender. So I can share this map. It's also on our website, but it just really gives an overview as to how big of a problem this is. And sometimes, as Southerners, it's easy to think, oh, well, or like the South, the Midwest, it's a lot of West Coast, East Coast, supposedly liberal places that have it. So it's really a issue that people across this nation are trying to address. Now let's focus on Louisiana. I know I sound... So as I said, we are a trendsetter in the sense that 1987 is the first year that our state signed into law what at the time was called intentional exposure to AIDS virus. And it was only until 2018 in which it was updated to intentional exposure to HIV virus. What's also interesting is when the Ryan White Act first came down, it was lauded, it was applauded because it was finally some resources at the federal level that were going to states for what many states have been seeing and not have like the resources to address the epidemic. Not very well known part of it is that in order for a state to get the Ryan White, dollars, they had to verify they had a means of prosecuting people who intentionally transmit HIV. So again, we talk about intent and not impact. Now, it was overturned in 2000, but from 93 to 2000, that's 7 years. So again, we talk about intent versus impact. What does it mean that the Ryan White Act, which is super helpful, super necessary, again, not the intent, has been a vehicle that really has increased criminalization because states made sure that they had a vehicle. And unfortunately, most states did that via how? By passing HIV specific laws. Side note, just piece of history, it is no longer in the Ryan White Act, but the fact that it was to begin with, I think is something that is worth noting. Again, Louisiana already had one. So we didn't have to worry about, we had means of prosecuting, and by 93 had actually prosecuted people under both our specific statute and, again, our general criminal law. That's that. I'm actually going to pull up the statute. Let's see if there's Wi-Fi. Do you want to continue? I do. Let's see what happens.
I noticed that, I guess it was 5 states that had the yellow circle on your map. And what does the yellow circle stand for?
Yellow circle, I think it was states that require you to register as a sex offender if you are, charged and found guilty, or often, honestly, is plead guilty, to an HIV crime.
There was, one in Montana, I know one in Ohio, one here, one in Arkansas, and I'm not sure where the 5th one is.
Washington had, I think it looked like both. It had the green and the yellow.
Let's see.
Did
Let me
it?
go back.
Washington State. Yeah.
Oh, okay, 1, 2. So
the green means they have reformed or repealed a portion of their HIV specific. So
it's 6,
let's talk about that, right? It's possible to reform or modernize in some way, like you point out Washington, but they still have kept that provision.
Gotcha.
So,
and somebody had a question back there, it sounded like.
Oh, no. I was actually going to use a hotspot.
Oh, no, thank you.
I have a housing-related question. That's always the common question.
You have a what related?
Housing.
Oh, yeah.
I had come across a reasonable accommodation request as a means of fighting HIV criminalization, and I can't find the webinar itself, but it's from y'all. Is there any way I could get that?
It's called our ATAC program, ATAC project. So the idea is, I was going to get into this, but this is perfect. Sonia, so good to see you. So anytime there is oppression, there's people who resist it in all the ways. Organizers, activists, advocates, lawyers, all of that. And so almost from the get-go, folks have brought various challenges to address this. And the biggest challenge that folks have brought is challenging the constitutionality of these laws, which makes a lot of sense because it clearly violates equal protection, all of these things. To date, there has not been a successful constitutional challenge in any jurisdiction. So just as a strategist, why would you use the same tools that so far have not worked? So part of what I think is needed is imaginative lawyering. And so CHOP and many others form like the ATAC project, which stands for Attack criminalization via the ADA. I know I'm saying the acronym wrong, but that's the idea. Use the fact that HIV is a disability under the Americans with Disability Act, then the amended 2008 ADAA, which essentially expanded the ADA, made it more accessible, using that as a basis to challenge these laws by saying this state is actually in violation of the ADA.
And on the individual client level, could you challenge like a client being denied admission to like a unit? Could you submit like an
That's
ADA
under the
request?
that's under the Fair Housing Act.
Okay.
So this is about challenging the criminal laws that already exist. That's established. That like the Fair Housing Act includes race, national origin, disability, other stuff. And housing is defined as any kind of facility, basically anything that's not like prison or jail. Mm-hmm. So that's something that I know there is Crescent Care Legal Services. I know there is Frontline Legal Services. Right. I know there is Legal Aid. I know there are some private attorneys, but that's definitely something to. Oh, and of course there's the Fair Housing Action Center. I would actually start with the Fair Housing Action Center, right. Which is now is working across the whole state. At one point, it was just in New Orleans, and I'm very glad now sees the need to do work across the whole state because it was never just happening here. So not to tell you what to do, if it's an ongoing issue, I would suggest reaching out to the Fair Housing Action Center and making them aware to file a complaint. But just so everyone knows, any sort of facility or group home, they are covered by the Fair Housing Act. And if somebody is denied for those bases, that's definitely a reason, it's definitely grounds to bring some sort of complaint.
I believe it was either yourself within this space or the panel. I believe it was the question I have deals with what does access to health care look like for those who are incarcerated, who are living with HIV?
My understanding is it varies. A person does have a right, like, to get their medications, like any kind of medications. If they are a diabetic, heart medications, all of that, and having a right and it actually happening are very different things, especially in a state such as Louisiana, which unfortunately has had to have federal investigations in terms of how people who are incarcerated are treated. So it's also like a matter of funding, in terms of like, even if that prison or if that jail, wants to do the thing, they may not have the funding to get that kind of medication, things like that. Sometimes they do have the funding, and then you get into issues of biases with the nurse or the warden or the guards or whatever. So people are supposed to have access to their medications, not just HIV, just being incarcerated doesn't stop if you have a condition. You should still, get like whatever it is. But again, it doesn't mean that it happens. I know here, our public health department, Office of Public Health, works a lot with folks who are incarcerated and have programs around like making sure that folks who are incarcerated are able to get access, as well as when folks are released, getting them into care, getting them housing, all of that. My understanding is they work mostly with the state prisons, which is different than if you're in jail. Generally, jail is pretrial detention, like when you're waiting for your trial or if you're serving a misdemeanor. And prison is for like if you, have already been sentenced and are serving some sort of felony. So it's much harder in terms of these issues in prison. Like just for example, if I'm in pretrial detention, waiting for my trial, it's set for 180 days. It could take 2 months as far as for the request to come in. But I'm only there for 6 months, so like those sort of barriers can also be there. So.
I just have a follow-up. What's your opinion on medical segregation within the jails if someone has an HIV diagnosis?
Could you say more about what medical, like having to be like a separate cell?
Yeah, so sometimes they will put folks in medical segregation, so they're away from the general population, but individual cells tend to be less humane, we'll say.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts?
I would just question what's the reason for the segregation. Like, that's the same thing when, like, trans people are put in separate cells and they say it is for their safety. I just need you to justify, like, again, is there no other way of doing this thing that you say? And really, it exposes, like, the lack of sexual health education and infectious disease education happening at every levels. I think sometimes, like, we talk about education, like our sexual health, like it's just for young people in schools. As a lawyer, I can 1,000% assure you that there are not doctors or like being highly educated does not mean that you understand any of this. A huge part of my life as a litigator was educating my co-counsel, sometimes opposing counsel, the judge, on basic things that any volunteer advocate learns probably on day one. And so that's also true of people who are guards and officers, law enforcement. Like, a huge part of how this happens is people are arrested. So if we're educating the folks who are arresting about what actually transmits, like on why exposure is a horrible bar, that's something that is helpful as we do this long-term work of reforming the law. But my opinion is, I would say it's vastly unnecessary, and I think people use it as a way not to do the work of prescribing medications. You know what I mean? And it's just really unfortunate. Like, to me, it's a form of discrimination. Yes. Now, I'm saying that, but that's different than a court saying. So please don't be like, well, this lawyer said that she went to the Supreme Court and they said, I would gladly argue that it is, but so far, that's not the process. But frankly, it just makes me very upset, and I think it makes most people, here that way. It's very unfortunate, honestly.
I think you need to contact Frontline, and they would look into that stuff. I wanted to ask you about, when was the expansion of ADA? Because that's something new. I never heard of that.
Oh, sorry. See, I shouldn't be pressing stuff on on computers that I don't know. So it happened in 2008.
Okay.
So, like, it's confusing because there's the ADA and then there's the ADAA, which is basically just an expansion of the ADA.
So it now includes HIV?
No, it included HIV in 2000. In the original, in the 90s.
Right.
But what the expansion did across the board is, so before, as far as for HIV, like, it was focused on asymptomatic or symptomatic. And the expansion said, you don't got to do all that. If you have HIV, that's enough to be covered. You know what I mean? So it really shifted the burden in terms of, that's a lot, like, for someone to have to be like, well, what's asymptomatic, da-da-da-da, what's right. Symptomatic. It's a way to, because, like, for any sort of claim of discrimination, the first thing you have to do is prove that you had the thing that makes you a protected class.
Right.
So now it's easier to say, I am in that protected class. You see what I'm saying?
How are the states dealing with that? Well, if you brought up something like that in, like, I don't know, state of Louisiana, has that been brought up quite a bit?
I'm not sure how often it's challenged. Our states, actually. So in housing, it's been more of an issue, which is why, like, fair housing is one of the reasons, like, how come fair housing expanded across the state. Not just HIV, but HIV is one of the issues, and surprise, racial discrimination is the reason why they, expanded to other parts, especially in some of the rural parts of the state. But so housing is an area that, like, I'm from here, so I'm not one to make us feel bad. It's just a lot of work that we have to do, in terms of, like, our state is really good. And I think like we saw this with abortion access. Prior to the Dobbs decision, our state would pass laws that organizations would have to sue. And even though the Supreme Court would be like a different Supreme Court, of course, would eventually say, okay, our state took it too far. You still spent our money in defending something that was unconstitutional before Dobbs. So it's like our state has a history of doing things, even if it would have to be challenged constitutionally, if that makes sense. So I just, it's a lot. But this is the actual state statute. Oh, I don't know why you can't see that. I'm sorry. So I'm just going to have this be as it is. But I can send you the link. Here's what I love about our state, though, is how accessible some things are. If you go to legis.la.gov, you can search for virtually any statute. .la.gov. Oh, I'm just trying to click that, and it pulled up, but it didn't show.
Yeah,
it's okay. It's fine. Thank you. It's so amazing. So often we talk about, a lawyer. You do not need a lawyer to find a state statute. If somebody tells you that they are lying, you should not trust them. So at any time, if you want to read for yourself, it is revised statute 14:43.5. That is our intentional exposure to HIV statute. So I basically know it offhand. You have to look at it. Like the first part focuses on intentional exposure to HIV. Nowhere in the statute is it talking about an intent of any sort. In terms of a specific intent. Also, again, our state is one of the ones that focuses on exposure, not transmission. Nowhere in our statute does it say you have to actually transmit to be found guilty. Then our state has this weird, arbitrary-ass clause called means or contact, which we know the ways that HIV can be transmitted. Why would you allow this very broad, super obnoxious means or contact?
Is that because we still have it as exposure being spitting, biting, and blood exposure?
That's the next part. Exactly. So it's very clear, and unfortunately, there are people who are currently serving time in this very moment under the statute who have not transmitted HIV. So even if we say, okay, the intent is to catch these people who are transmitting, you didn't do that. You did not do that. Like, there are people right now who are serving who did not transmit. So even if we take your intent, which I don't, I think it came from racism and homophobia as to why it was, first passed in 87, modernized in 93, and from 93 to 2018 was not touched. What happened scientifically in the HIV world between 93 and 2018? Everything. What's happened between 18 and 22?
You equals you, baby.
Right, so much. And the fact that time span, so that's part of it.
With that U equals U, that also is a person would still be prosecuted regardless of that.
Correct.
Absolutely.
With just exposure, no matter what.
That's what I'm...
Well, that's another part of it. 2018 was a wild-ass year. It added a clause called affirmative defenses. Again, not to get all dweeby on you, this is what an affirmative defense means, and is why I will continue to be anti-affirmative defenses as we talk about modernization. It says, I did the thing that you say I did. Like, suppose I, wanted to fight somebody, and I'm charged with battery and assault. I could plead not guilty. I didn't do the thing. I could plead not guilty, but make an affirmative defense saying, no. I'm not saying I didn't beat her up. I'm saying it was self-defense. So I'm saying I did the thing, but I'm saying I had a reason why. So in 2018, our state added a whole clause of affirmative defenses that said, if somebody used protection, that is an affirmative defense. If somebody had reason to believe, it didn't say undetectable, but it said had reason, to believe by a medical professional that they couldn't transmit, that's an affirmative defense. My concern with that is why would you make someone admit the thing that they are being accused of?
Thank you.
It puts the burden on the defense. Mm-hmm. Because what happens is it's the job of the prosecutor to bring the claim. Mm-hmm. They have to prove every element of the thing, right? And if they can't do that, that's a basis to question, well, why is this happening? But when you assert an affirmative defense, the burden then shifts on the person who's accused to have to show, well, yes, I did expose, but I had a reason why. But guess what happens if the jury decides, actually, I don't take that affirmative defense. You can't then say, well, you know what? I was lying. I didn't do the thing that I literally just said that I did. So there's that. But then in the context of Louisiana, where unfortunately our state still holds the honor of incarcerating more people than anywhere else in the world, and a lot of those people are accessing our system via public defense, which why would you put more strain on a system that is already having so much pressure on the defense? Last thing, I don't want to get all like dweeby or whatever. Last thing, and affirmative defense is most useful at trial. These cases plead out because why would you want to go in front of a jury of your peers? How many of us have seen these articles about when someone's accused? They're awful. They're awful. The person's name is plastered everywhere. I had a client in Baton Rouge. He lost his job. He had to move. Then 2 months later, the charges was dropped. Do you think that newspaper printed another article with his face just as big saying, oops, charges were dropped? The damage was done. So in that context, who's going to want to make it to a trial? People plead. So again, you've added this whole section that historically isn't even useful because people mostly plead. So it's just putting a lot of pressure on people. And the last part is, this is not a misdemeanor, y'all. This is not a 6 months or pay a fine. You can get up to 10 years for this. Plus we have a heightened penalty. So if the alleged victim is somebody in law enforcement defined broadly, that's an extra year and a higher fine. So that is our law in a nutshell. So the question that sometimes people ask, okay, Mandisa, thank you for going into all of that about, the criminalization, how it looks in Louisiana. How does that connect to stigma? Well, there are a few ways. One is criminalization makes a lot of barriers. Again, even if you're not sentenced and charged and have the felony, it's very clear how felonies, in terms of it's still okay to say, I don't have to hire all these things. I know folks are doing amazing advocacy around that. And it's important to uplift them, but until our state takes a definitive stand, it's still possible. Also barriers to education, barriers to housing. Then again, because I am a Black feminist and I am intersectional, it's not just some mythical group of people who are criminalized. Black people are criminalized already in this state. We incarcerate more Black people than so many other places. So this is one more barrier, one more way that Black people are targeted. And it's worth noting that Black people are about a third of the population in the state, but over half of the people who are living with HIV. So we're overrepresented in terms of HIV And we're also overrepresented in terms of incarceration.
Yeah.
So again, this is a racial justice issue in terms of like that stigma. Also in terms of like the impact that it has on people who are gender expansive. It's something that unfortunately it isn't a lot of good data because trans women unfortunately are still often counted under men. So a lot of the data we have is anecdotal, but even with that data, we see who's really targeted. So when like data shows black men, I'm like, some of those are actually trans women who are wrongly counted. Like, let's just be very clear about that. Then, and I mentioned it earlier, like, is the media's role. Like, they have a responsibility to report accurate information. Like, and it's all about the clicks. It's all about the sensationalism of the story. It doesn't matter if when it boils out, that charge is dropped or this charge is dropped, and it's actually a misdemeanor. They've gotten their clicks, they've gotten their accolades, and they've moved on, and our communities are still dealing with that stigma. Because, come on, like, this is not a huge city that we're in. We're not a huge state. It travels. That was pre-social media. You know how fast it's traveling in the context of social media, where I can, target, one person and it spread quickly. But also it's stigmatizing because it really works against these public health goals that we say. Like everywhere I look, I see know your status, be empowered about your status, be empowered as someone living with HIV. And I believe that. And when you have a law that basically, like that essentially says you are on the hook if you know your status, that's literally undermining these public health goals. Because guess what? If I don't know my status, that is the biggest defense I have.
Exactly.
So what does it mean like that we're telling people this one thing, but then have this law that's literally contradicting that? So for me, I'm always like, this is a public health issue because it's literally undermining the goals we set out in terms of ending the epidemic.
Exactly.
So literally, if I have HIV and don't know I have it, I transmit it to someone, they are now living with HIV and they want to press charges, I can literally say, well, I didn't know I had it. Is that a defense?
You have to prove it.
You have to prove it.
But I think it'd be easy to prove.
Whereas the person that is living with HIV knows their status, being protected, undetectable, doing what they're supposed to do.
I can still be charged. Yes.
Because it's not about public health. Because I think we know that, like, I can talk to each person in this room and y'all can each come up with 10 different things that actually grow public health and can actually end the epidemic. And I don't think anyone would say putting people, like, criminalizing health conditions is definitely going to help us in the epidemic. But what I want to ask is, are there other ways that y'all see HIV criminalization as connected to stigma? I named some.
Yeah, I'm in that same role. I actually said it in the panel earlier with my situation.
Mm-hmm.
Having a doctor creating even more stigma by stating that, oh, well, even though you're negative today, 5-10 years down the road, you can be positive.
See?
That's creating so much stigma. And people go, and this was a black man, okay? So there's already the stigma of y'all going to the doctors. Like, who wants to believe them anyways? But they're supposed to be an authority for us to believe. And if they're giving us misinformation, they are stigmatizing all of us.
Yeah.
And not just those of us living with HIV. They're stigmatizing everyone. Because nobody wants to go. Nobody wants to believe. Well, who do I believe? And this is an intelligent man, but he's like, well, this is my doctor. I'm supposed to be able to believe him because, well, baby, he's not educated enough. Please let me know who he is, and I got a team I can bring out and let's educate him on.
But that person has to be willing to decenter ego.
Yep.
Like it's certain professions, lawyers, doctors, judges, folks like that who we're lauded as the creme of the creme.
Yep.
And it's like that, like you internalize that as who want to teach me? Like especially not another lawyer, another doctor.
Yep.
So I also think that yes, we can educate, and it also has to be like, look, my thing is make it mandate. Like so, CHLP has introduced federal legislation. It didn't go anywhere. That would essentially say any healthcare provider has to have sexual health education as a mandate of getting their licensure.
Yes.
And the purpose was, okay, like so you have the education around this, but you don't have the education around, like stigma, language, cultural competency, like making it be a required part, much like it's required to know certain steps or things like that. But it's just, yeah. Thank you for that example.
I mean, you lose your community, even just by the accusation.
Correct.
I saw stuff from people who live in Lake Charles on my Facebook page about like how they're nasty, gross, bad. I knew they were touching kids, all this stuff. When they spit on a cop, which is not even
right.
I think it's also used as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a sex worker, for example, well, I'm going to tell the cops that you have HIV.
Yeah.
I'm going to get you locked up for this. I'm going to do this. And so many people are afraid to disclose and live with that internal stigma because they will literally go to jail if someone else tells their status to the right authorities.
Or die.
Thank you for saying that. In terms of, it makes you more prone to intimate partner violence in terms of that's all, like one status, and the threat of criminalization is used as a tool of keeping someone in an abusive relationship, or no one's going to want you, so like take what you get from me, or if you leave me, I'm going to go to the cops and say. And because our law focuses on exposure, it's a lot of he said, she said, they said, she said, like however the relationship looks, because it's no way really of proving, which is why I encourage people, even if it's a hookup, screenshot you saying, oh, I'm living with HIV, send it to me, or send like to someone else who you trust. Like I used to work at AIDS Law, which is now Crescent Care. We would do affidavits for people who were in relationships, of like, I so-and-so signed this saying I'm aware that my partner is living with HIV. Yes, that's awkward. Yes, it's uncomfortable. And what's more awkward? Having to find a lawyer because somebody, has brought a charge. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not going to deal with the situation that you talk about, which is actually very prevalent in terms of how we define resisting arrest, in terms of like supposedly spitting on an officer, which who's to say it's spit and somebody's nervous and just has a juicy mouth? I'm not even being funny. Right. Who's to say it's spit? But because it's an officer and because it's, a person who's now incarcerated, who in society is seen as more
they were medically segregated
reputable.
At that point, and they were not given access to good food, and they did not have access to medication.
Exactly.
The idea that like a few droplets can lead to this person now being like a few droplets from emotions running wild, which it can also, I would imagine, also stem to sweat or just anything bodily fluid. But the point that the stigma that I wanted to think of is once a person who could be could be giving that sentence. It's something that can work towards the detriment of their health, because once you're in a setting where you have to deal with other people who are also incarcerated and they see that there's a stigma behind people who are sex offenders, and then you're talking about those same little spit droplets from in a situation now has other people looking at you as a sex offender, and I'm just gonna say, like, we all know what happens to people. There's the same, what happens to sex offenders when they go to jail. Like, exactly. Likely enough, it's terrifying.
Exactly.
To the mental health and their physical health.
Thank you for saying that. So hopefully, it's also like an opportunity to kind of re-examine like some assumptions like that we make. Because prior to doing this work, like whenever I would get that thing in the mail of sex offender, I would instantly, oh no. And since I've done this work, I'm like, oh, let me question these assumptions that I have about labels that I had been taught meant these things. Because, if it's clear that, this one example is actually stigmatizing, well, what are some other things that I've learned about quote unquote bad people that maybe I should relearn? So I think it's also an opportunity to to re-examine. How does this work against our ETE goals? Like we've said it, but are there more ways that like this stigma and criminalization is working against what we want in the state or in the country or the city?
Most definitely criminalization does. I mean, it really does. It blocks us, like you were saying, everything we do. People are like, well, yeah, of course, I know my status and everything, but okay, so it's going to get me in trouble.
It does block us, yeah.
It blocks me from getting people to test unboundedly,
When they pass more and more stringent laws, we always see a staff change in the public health department.
Ooh.
Like, there was specific extreme staff turnover after the abortion case got taken to the Supreme Court with that specific person's state of Louisiana's name on it. They led the health department.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's like boxing with hands tied behind your back.
So anytime, like we have this conversation, it can be very easy to just leave distraught and, we're fucked, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it helpful to end with, what can we do about it? So one thing that we can do is share scientifically accurate and destigmatizing information every time, which I know can be hard because who wants to be the person who gets branded, oh, she don't have fun, it was a joke. And, you can push back and be like, that's not funny. Like, people are in jail behind this, and you are forwarding this article on the Shade Room about a man in Oklahoma. Like, just challenging, like, even our families. Like, yes, it sounds small, but it's actually not, because part of how stigma is able to perpetuate is because we enable it.
Yep.
I'm not saying like that we are lawmakers, but those lawmakers are also family members who have Sunday dinners and all those things. And a lot of these conversations happen at dinner tables or happen in places, and we just think, oh, it's a conversation. And then 2 years later, that same lawmaker is regurgitating stuff that maybe they heard in the barbershop. So no, like, it does have an impact. And connected is, don't be afraid to challenge people who are forwarding these destigmatizing, views, on various things. Again, it's not about being an a-hole to people. It's not about screaming and yelling, but it's possible to, I'm just loud all the time, but you can be quiet and be like, that's actually, I don't get the joke, or that's actually not what's happening in Louisiana. In Louisiana, because, and the thing about it, it's factually true that, when we talk about officers and spit, there are not cases of officers or even healthcare providers who were stuck with these mythical needles who have contracted, who seroconverted. It is a myth that is perpetuated. Ask them, well, who do you know?
Exactly.
What's the basis of you making this broad statement outside of sensationalism and just the popular imagination? There are no cases. Name the person who is in jail who actually transmitted. You know what I mean? Also, find people in your area who are working on this. I'm going to plug LCCH. I am. And to be quick, I said folks have been working on this since it was first passed. Anytime there's oppression, there are at least 2 people in resistance. That's a factual statement. Mm-hmm. Since 1492, people have been in resistance. Don't want to invisibilize that. And this version of the resistance, since 2016, is myself and several other advocates came together and formed what is now called the Louisiana Coalition on Criminalization and Health. And our purpose is to modernize our state statute and not just run HIV, because remember in 2021 we had to deal with the lawmaker who wanted to expand from HIV into other STIs. So it's not like we started with HIV criminalization, but we understand it. Yes, it didn't go. But the fact that was even a possibility is wild, and that was 2021.
And it was a Democrat, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a Democrat, because we talk about politics in these certain ways, when in actuality it's certain issues that really are transcending, the political affiliates. So, LCCH is not the only group but they are an active group who has really been involved. I have 2 emails on here. There's Deets, LCCH, coordinator at gmail.com or lcchinfo@gmail.com.
Please join us. We need all the people we can get. It's a lot of work.
Also, I'm volunteer with Human Rights Campaign.
Yes.
I'm on the board of governors for Louisiana, and I'm the chair of the planning committee here. And y'all will be really surprised at the lawmakers that know nothing about this.
Oh,
Literally know nothing. That some don't even know this is on the books.
No.
To be honest, so it's a lot of work of like educating, of course, but also making sure people know exactly how they can help and what they can do as lawmakers, because a lot of them just feel like, well, what can I get out of this? And a lot of times it's like, nothing. But your people will get a lot out of this. So we need to make sure that we're taking care of the folks. So I'm working hard on doing some of that work as well. I would love to work with y'all.
Well, is it possible that y'all can connect? Y'all haven't
Boom.
already? Sonia is on the steering committee for LCCH. So, yeah. What was your question? I'm sorry.
What organization did you say?
You say it again.
Oh, the Human Rights Campaign, I'm sorry.
HIC. What was I gonna? Ooh, it went out that quick. The thought I had. I guess it'll come back. But I feel like you, Edric.
Yeah, I just have a question. Well, first I just want to make a comment that I think, your point about asking people, who do you know? Because, that it stuck someone with a needle or got stuck with a needle is a good question to ask. But in the legislative arena, it's hard because you'll hear, I can just hear legislators saying that. And you can't, as a person sitting at a table, ask them that. And so I think even the thought of bringing a policy change, bringing a bill to change this is scary because they can say anything they want on the dais, and they can come from, like you said, legislators of different backgrounds, parties, and genders and races. And a lot of them have a lot of misinformation that could come out of their mouth and really be harmful. I think even in the context of a conversation of trying to improve the law, you take risks even bringing it up in those forums. And so I'm just curious on that note. I'm with the health department, and I have participated in LCCH. I was on maternity leave the last few months, but I'm just wondering, is there an intent to bring a bill next session? I know it's a fiscal session. And
once I started my job in October, I had to step away, but Sonia can answer. And I do have some thoughts about strategies.
Yeah, we are actually talking about, just kind of looking at things because it's so close this time and really looking at going for the next time. I mean, we're in those talks. Like I said, we just got our coordinator, and Deets is going to rock us. They are going to keep us where we need to be. So looking forward, I think we are going to hold off on this term and then going for the next. That way we can really focus, really dig in. And again, with Deets as our coordinator, we're going to keep right on track. So that was our best investment, I can honestly say, in the long run, was making sure we had a coordinator.
Our coalition had been volunteer for a very long time. And earlier this year had made the decision to get funding and just get someone to do what Deets has said. One of the things that I think has been helpful in other arenas that, we can learn from is sharing the cost of incarceration. Like the Williams Institute out of UCLA does reports on various states on what is the arrest data. A couple months ago did one on Louisiana. And the stats are things that we know, but to see the numbers, 90% are black men. Again, I think it's some trans women in there. Our state isn't documenting sexuality, so we don't know. But I would imagine it's the mixture, across the sexuality spectrum, and the cost is in the several millions, tens of millions. So I think that is one avenue of this is what it costs. Because our state is always broke, and is always, in need of some kind of fiscal rehaul. So, I think it's worth us exposing, in terms of if we have really good data and it's not from us, which can be good or bad in a state like ours that isn't always open to outside information. But I think it's helpful just to show, like, here's what it's cost since, 93. Here's what it's cost since 90. Is it worth it as one strategy?
I also have a policy question on the affirmative defenses. Is it preferable to have it just those? Because you read those and you think, oh, that's good. That seems good. And I think, would it be better if it were you cannot be prosecuted if you have if you have these, like if you have a doctor who says you're undetectable or.
So, I think it could be helpful. Not personally, it's a personal thing. Strategically, it doesn't serve us in the long run to use one's undetectable status as the basis for these laws. Because whether we mean to or not, it's creating a viral, a divide, because it's a lot of reasons why people aren't undetectable. Even people who take their medication daily and do the right things. I think the studies show if you have comorbidities or if you have co-diseases, that lessens the likelihood. Again, you're doing the right things. I believe strategically having a law that focuses on specific intent to transmit and actual transmission is the best way to ensure the smallest amount of people who are those who it can be proven did, who were clear. Yes, I know that I could which is and here's the thing about it, I think it's hard for folks to realize. That's a very small percentage of people. Under 0.01. And that's just a reality, because I don't care what we think about people. No one's out here for the vast, vast, vast majority out here being like, yep, I want to ruin your life. And in this way. So that's the part that I think we are still parsing out. It can be helpful, but even if you are detectable, I think the CDC said less than 2%. So it's not if you're undetectable or detectable, that's the big threshold here.
Yeah.
So that was also the issue as far as affirmative defenses. It's these aren't the only things to be conscious of.
And then we don't want to create that stigma. As a U=U ambassador, we try to make sure that we also, your viral load does not equal your value. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's great I'm undetectable, but that some people can never reach to that again. So we don't want to stigmatize each other in the middle of trying to, do this work, this part of the work either. So, it's that fine line. It's really a fine line.
U=U is an amazing tool. I think it's one of the best things that has happened in the HIV movement. And that's different than U=U being a legal tool to address criminalization, which the folks who are doing the work at PAC, they've never said, it's a tool to address criminalization. I feel like they're clear that it's an empowerment tool, all these things, but I think they've been very clear. We never said this was to substitute for criminal modernization. And I think states have really taken that and been like, oh, great. I know North Carolina had an example in their public health code. What was it, 15, 16? Please don't quote me on the year. But it was fairly recent, in the last 10 years, of course, that focus on undetectable viral load. And it didn't actually stop the charges as they thought it would. Because then cops were like, okay, well, then we'll just get the people who can't prove, these things. Because, we're meeting and strategizing, and they are too.
There's disparities.
Exactly. It's very racialized. So, those are emails for people. Just keeping it a buck. I'm not the best person to reach if you're looking for legal support around when LCCA is when it's time for us to look at the bills. I know Jada and Amir are part of the calls. Jada, staff attorney, is the first kind of line of contact around that. Amir is our national policy and partner strategist. They're the folks on the ground. I'm just the boring person raising money and stuff. So I did put my email up here because it'd be weird for me not to. And either way, if you do email me, I'm going to include them because, like, they're the ones in the state coalitions. Because a huge part of what CHRP does is we support state coalitions who are doing this sort of work and, like, offer bill drafting, and review and strategies, like for talking with legislators, talking with other people in the community on these issues. So just being true as to who are the folks who would be the most useful. But I would just forward it to them. But let's talk about this. But super excited to be in this conversation. And we ask questions during, but if folks have any more questions or more comments, it's 1:44. We have 15 more minutes. Yes.
I have a question. First off, I want to thank you. Yes, I'm new to New Orleans. I will be 2 weeks tomorrow that I've been here.
Oh, you do?
Welcome. Thank you. And I'm new to this line of work.
I haven't gotten mail transferred yet.
Yeah, I got bills, right? Just my bills. But I'm also new to this population. I'm also new to working with people living with HIV, so I'm a new centralized linkage coordinator. So I'm going to be working specifically with our jails. So many questions, have popped into my head. Like, I don't even know where to start, so I'm just going to ask you and everybody, like, what do I need to be focused on? Because... Who?
Jean Schnecksnyder. She does the jail that happened, the linkage care for the jails.
I was going to ask, who do you work for?
Lots.
Oh, okay.
It's the...
So you're with the city, okay?
Yes, ma'am. The city of New Orleans. And can you spell that last name for me?
Oh,
okay.
I don't, yeah.
So Jean Schnecksnyder is one of the coordinator for the state prison system. The challenges that we are having right now is working with the jail system.
Right.
And when an individual is being released, you don't necessarily get the notice. And so we don't have that opportunity to coordinate before individuals are released. But what we have been doing behind the scene, and so happy that Becky is now here in New Orleans and launching it off, is that, during COVID, our agencies that could not go into the jail system. OJC is the first pilot test. And so we have individuals who are released and we did not have linkage to. And so what we're doing is coordinating with the social workers at OJC and the medical staff with WellPath so that before they are released, while they're in jail, we're able to communicate and link with individuals so when they are released, we can help to facilitate the care and services by continuing that coordination with OJC and also agencies that are funded by our office. And also, we'll be working on coordinating with the state if they should leave the area.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying in terms of as far as, like, I was going to ask, are you in one area or are you stabilized like you're here?
Yeah.
So
I mean, the reason why I ask is because, again, I believe with lived experience, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what I don't know, and I'm big on, like, okay, break this down. Like, where am I going? What am I supposed to be doing? But there were so many bits and pieces that were just like, okay, from the provider standpoint, from the case manager, from the client, I'm like, how can I try to promote you equals you? But then, like, you just hit me with a whole nother thing. So it's like so many things. My mind is just like, I don't know what my questions are, but I guess my question is just how can I best serve this population and how can I really destigmatize and decriminalize? Because that's my education's in criminal justice, but I'm a social worker. So I'm like, what can I do to best serve?
Are you connected with Frontline? Because I know I
Yes.
used to.
Yes. So Penny
I know,
would be great.
as somebody who used to work at Frontline, I know, like you said, that was a huge barrier in terms of, like, when COVID and not having access, because, like, that's how Frontline mainly, interacted with folks, who were on the inside, was by being able to come, and get visits. So, just thinking of that. I also know it was a provider there, or at least in OJC, that Frontline worked with and, would, like, get information. So I know Frontline ended up doing a lot of paper and even made some, like, accessible videos to share since like the staff couldn't actually go inside, anymore. I mean, it was even hard for like attorneys who had clients inside, like as far as the visit. And it's like, you have trial in 2 months. I got to see my person. I'll wear a mask, you know. But it seems like, well, that's part of what I thought is like stuff would open up and like a new variant, then it closed down. Then okay, the variant, then it opened back up. Then there's an outbreak of COVID in the jail, and they had to close again. So it seems like it's still inconsistent like that. Oh God, sounds stressful.
How is the sheriff? Have you dealt with Hudson?
Nope.
Really?
I will say that the people I have met at OJC have been very welcoming, and they are very excited about us coming back. So we're receiving a lot of support. But I have not met that person.
Oh, you haven't met with the sheriff? Okay.
She's new, and it's a pretty big deal that she is the sheriff. Like she ran on a progressive platform, which is very hard to not be progressive when the person who was there before was, you know. But that's another conversation. So
If
I would
you talk
imagine.
to her communication director, I think you can get a lot of information.
And her name is Susan Hudson. I think is it Hutson?
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And she used to be the monitor.
Oh,
Isn't it interesting?
IPM.
Reed, I've had your map. I was kind of pleased to see on the states
Want
that
to go
had
back to it?
improved their laws. Wasn't wasn't a bunch of northeastern or west coast states.
Exactly.
So I think Missouri had improved.
Texas.
Iowa. So
Georgia.
and so I'm just Texas. So I'm just wondering. You mentioned quantifying the cost of incarceration, and I know you just sort of assumed a national role, so maybe you haven't had like the national landscape for all of this. But are you familiar with any of the like strategies or ways that they've had progressive change in pretty red states?
Well, what's cool is it's very recent. Like Georgia just modernized theirs earlier this year.
Okay.
So like that data is like literally in the works. Texas actually repealed their entire criminal law, which so far hasn't meant an end of people being arrested. Because again, like folks are being arrested under like the general statute, but it still happened, in a way like where folks are like getting that data. Like I know in Texas, Positive Women's Network, because I know one of their co-directors is based there, Benita.
Yeah.
So I know it's like it's collecting work around like exactly what you're saying is like what has changed, what has the cost been?
Okay, but like, how did they do? Were there like, I don't know, what was the secret? It just seems like so hard to affect positive. Having worked in the Texas legislature, like I'm just amazed that anyone was able to get something like that done. I'm just wondering, like, are there case studies like here's what our coalition looked like, or here's what our funders were?
Contact, like getting in touch with Benita Ray.
Okay.
And if you go to Positive Women's Network, which I'm also a member of that one, you can like find Benita's information.
Okay.
And have her email.
At the end of 2021, LCCH had a modernization summit on HIV crim, and Benita spoke about what Texas, did. So it's also folks in the state who are like, oh, okay, you're our neighbor. Like literally, look at Dobbs.
Yeah.
It's either Mississippi abortion clinics, us abortion clinics, or Texas. So like we do, like we're all, have a connection in terms of like literally our states are often vying for who is the most conservative.
Right.
So I think out of all these states, Texas is the most applicable to us. I agree. And it was a really great conversation. I know folks are building off of what Texas did, not because it could be copied and pasted, but many parts of it, I think, could.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I remember it being a really good conversation. Because, like, it's one of those things where it's not that people don't want to hear what's happening in California or what's happening in New York. It's just that it's not applicable to our state government. So why would I want to hear, like, in California, midwifery is included in Medicaid. We're still fighting that here. You know what I mean? It's just a different culture. So I think it's helpful when we have examples in the Deep South. Like, I also think Georgia is one that needs to be studied.
Yeah.
And that one's so recent that I think now is the best time because the data is coming out now. It hasn't even been a full year since they made their change.
Mandy, I have a question, because you know my history. Is my home state the only state that is doing that, like they're doing with Nushan? Are there other cases of somebody being held in civil confinement like Nushan?
You want to talk more about Nushan first?
Yeah, Nushan, I don't know if anybody knows, Nushan Williams, back in 96, 97,
Yeah.
about 15 minutes from my hometown in New York, Jamestown, New York. He had been arrested for transmitting the HIV virus. He did his time.
Right.
Served his time like anybody else. He is still being held in civil confinement. What's the exact civil confinement that they're using?
So he served his time, and instead of getting out, he was just put in another prison, but they call it, what she said, civil confinement. And they're saying, because it's a New York law, that basically somebody has the right, like, to be confined if they're still a danger to society.
Correct.
And the basis is like.
So I jumped out of the frying
predator.
pan and into the fire because I went from New York to here.
So yes, there are other states.
There are.
Like,
I wasn't sure on that one, honestly.
yeah, like it's something that one's a very powerful example.
Very.
CHLP is a part of the Free Nushan Coalition.
Yep.
It's really awful. He just made 46.
Correct. And he was 19 at the
Oh
time.
my goodness.
NUSHAWN.
Davis.
I don't know if
Yeah.
you're behind that. So you mean to tell me this man
Served his time.
served his time?
He would have been better off.
When you're a danger to society,
So
which is the
because he's living with HIV.
Correct.
He's a danger to society.
well, they say
Correct.
that was used as an enhanced. So the reason, so he was charged, like, and to me this is HIV criminalization, but it's not clocked as that. He was 19 at the time and he was engaged in activity with 16-year-old white women, white girls. It's important to say exactly.
Let me
You don't got to say
you
anything
got it
else.
right there because growing up, I was,
So the immaterial.
correct.
That part.
Correct. And to walk into my neighboring city
They don't
and see
care.
posters that say, do not have sex with a black man because he'll give you AIDS. It didn't stop me by no means, obviously.
Okay.
But
What year was that?
1997. I mean, my daughter is like 25, going to be 26 years old. I mean, I was pregnant for her when this all happened. And like, I was astounded by it. I was disgusted by it then, and I am triply disgusted by it now. He would have been better off taking a gun out and shooting a man in the head or somebody in the head. He would have been better off because he'd be out by now.
And so to me, like, what's most horrible about that situation is he served his time. So really, it goes against what we tell people: serve your time and then da 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 da. No, because he served his sentence and it's still there.
Still there.
And I think it's an opportunity for us to really question how we, as the public, are sold these ideas of public health and public safety and what that's code for. Because he's there because he's seen as a sexual predator. He's seen as a threat to public safety. So, you know, especially in a town like here that has high gun and all of that, this is not to take away from like people's experiences of being robbed and all of that. How is public health, how is public safety sold to us? And what's it really about? What's actually, like, the fact is, if it was 16-year-old black girls, he would be out.
Exactly.
If he had even been incarcerated in the first place. So like the racialized, patriarchal nature is always there.
It's kind of crazy how Patrick Como, who just was,
Who was the one who did that?
who just was like speculated in sexual harassment,
Correct.
is the person who blocked him
That
from,
Correct. That's a major point,
from
honey.
getting out. That's so wild. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's been in my heart since then, and I've only been diagnosed with HIV since 2017. You know, so, but the fact is it has not even taken into effect his viral load. Like, you know what? I test in probation and parole. You know, I do testing there. Like, we bring them in and they have to do drug testing to stay out on parole.
Right.
Like, he has an undetectable viral load, or his viral load is so low, under 200. Make him go in every month. You know what I'm saying?
What's his name? What's his name?
Nushan Williams.
Can you please spell it?
Please.
NUSHAWN, then Williams.
Gotcha.
WILLIAMS.
You said it's in New York, right?
In New York, if they approach the governor's office,
He was the governor.
They've done
They
everything.
have done everything.
Andrew-
They have done. I can't say we. They have done
Andrew
everything.
Cuomo has since been
fine
the
with
governor.
Yeah.
you make me.
I know there are states in the United States that a person's declared innocent and they're still in jail.
But see, but here's
Missouri.
the thing about this: civil commitment.
Is different.
Exactly.
It's
He's
a
not
different-
there criminally.
Right.
He served his criminal. That's what's wild about it. It's also
Is it?
a workaround in that you see what I'm saying? Like
They're doing
civil.
it like on a medical, like
Mhm.
they're not doing it on a. They're just doing it because
Yeah, it's not a
It's
criminal.
similar to someone who's like committed based on
Like a mental
Yeah.
condition.
Kinda.
I guess,
The
yeah.
thought is you can't function in society. However,
Like a
functioning is fine.
mental condition or something.
Exactly.
And let me say that in there, I can remember back when it was happening, and of course, it was going to the route of, well, he was going after them to intentionally do this.
They called this man an AIDS monster?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
They
White
intentionally.
We're marching through town with his picture,
Yes.
saying he's a threat.
Yeah.
Yes, they were. And like they made it out. And I'm sorry, but I was that 14, 15, 16-year-old little white girl chasing on y'all. So y'all. So how can they use that as that defense? You know what I'm saying? It's like they're going to turn it around. And I was 13, 14 years old when I met my first husband, who was not a black man, but I was chasing him at 14. So how are you going to sit there and say that they weren't chasing him? Because they're very capable of doing
here's
that.
the other issue
when you
with
got the
it.
white
That's
lady
a
that,
separate issue.
Correct.
To me,
but
like,
that's
the
how they
fact
got
that
him there.
we make any of that about HIV is a part of the issue.
Yeah, exactly.
So we should be having conversations again outside of the criminal legal system about why a 14, 15-year-old is engaged with an adult. That to me is not it's not an HIV issue because it shouldn't matter if the person is living with HIV or not.
But that's how they got
And
him.
again, the question is, why are these things that we're told have to be solved in the criminal legal system?
But they don't.
Exactly.
They don't.
And
They need
again,
solid education.
it's the racialized aspect of who are these public laws supposed to protect? White property interests.
Thank you.
And to close, New York is doing a lot. I don't know if folks are familiar with Robert Suttle.
Yes, he's amazing.
Robert is an amazing black man from Shreveport who he was criminalized under this law, served his time, of course had to register as a sex offender. He ended up moving out of the state, moved to New York, has been living there ever since. And one of the questions he had is, since New York, as you see the orange, is one of those states that does not have an HIV specific statute, and since he was found guilty, pled guilty and served was sentenced under, why should he have to register as a sex offender when it's not a similar law in New York? And it went to a court. The first court said, no, you still have to register. Then it went to the appeal court. That decision just came out the end of September. And so now it's being appealed to the Supreme Court of New York as to whether, and it's really an important issue in terms of what does it mean to enforce another state's sex offender registry. But that started, right here in Louisiana, but also New York, has a lot to say in terms of the district attorney there. His office had written a brief in support of him registering, and the AG, Attorney General, the same AG who has consistently said Nushan should stay in civil confinement, has also said no, he needs to register. So again, it's a lot happening with Louisiana and New York right now.
It is. That's why I feel so
Yeah.
great in the session because I get to learn from all.
Robert is also one of the co-founders of the coalition. Because many people, his experience, he didn't even know this law existed until he was arrested under. And unfortunately, that's a very common experience for folks to learn something, in the moment. And so, yeah.
He's
I'll
still
close
very
there.
active.
He's very
Very
active.
active
Yeah.
with
He's an
our
amazing
folks.
activist. Oh, you're welcome. Thank y'all. I'm really excited to have this conversation.